My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the better part of my adult life building a reputation for being reliable, discreet, and endlessly patient. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other, and I learned early that trust is fragile, but loyalty is priceless. After college, I moved to the city, working my way up in a family-run investment firm, quietly earning respect while staying under the radar. I wasn't flashy, I didn't crave attention, but I had an eye for patterns, for numbers, for people, and perhaps that made me too predictable and dangerously overlooked. The betrayal began quietly, like a whisper you think you imagined. My sister, someone I had defended, supported, and confided in for years, started changing her tone, asking helpful questions about my finances, my investments, even the small savings I'd tucked away for emergencies. At first, I shrugged it off. Family asks questions, family worries. But the subtlety of her questions felt like a measuring stick, the kind you use when you're testing a door you intend to open without permission. It wasn't until the day she showed up with a lawyer, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes, that I understood the depth of what had been brewing. The house, the money, everything my grandparents had left me, she had quietly maneuvered to put it under her control. Legally and meticulously, they had twisted trust into a weapon, and I had walked straight into it without realizing. She wasn't aggressive, she was methodical, and in that moment I realized that anger wouldn't serve me. It would only make me predictable. Instead, I smiled. Not the small, polite smile I'd plastered on at family dinners, but the kind that conceals everything underneath. I thanked her for coming by, asked her politely to sit, and listened as she detailed the plan, never once betraying that I knew it was already neutralized. You see, months before my wedding, when everyone else assumed I was too naive to notice, I quietly moved the bulk of my inheritance into a trust, one that gave me control but looked on paper untouchable. Standing there, watching her eyes flicker as she realized I wasn't panicking, I felt a calm I hadn't expected. The same patience that had defined my career now shielded me from a family's quiet deception. I had been preparing silently for a betrayal I hadn't even allowed myself to name, and now that it had arrived, I realized how powerful it could feel to be the one holding all the cards while pretending to hold none at all. And in that room, with her smirk fading and her confidence wobbling, I understood that this wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about proving. Not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with silent, deliberate strategy that no one could underestimate me, not even my own blood. That moment became the spark. I didn't know exactly how the next steps would unfold, but I knew one thing. This was the beginning of a quiet, unshakable reckoning. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying every conversation, every shared secret, every moment of trust with my sister, searching for the signs I had missed. It was a painful exercise, not because I regretted the trust I had given, but because I realized how easily loyalty can be weaponized. I remembered the subtle smiles that didn't reach her eyes, the questions about my work, my future, my plans. Each one felt innocent at the time, each one carefully measured, and yet, in hindsight, they were pieces of a puzzle I had been too polite to notice, too patient to question. The betrayal cut deeper than any argument could have. Anger was fleeting. It came in small, quiet waves and left just as quickly, replaced by a strange, focused clarity. I realized that if I let anger dictate my actions, I would play right into her hands. That was never my way. I had spent years learning to read people, to anticipate outcomes, to understand motivations without exposing my own. And now, more than ever, those lessons became my shield. I would not respond impulsively. I would respond intelligently, deliberately, silently. I started observing her differently, cataloging her habits, her small tells, the way she thought she was clever, but left patterns behind in her interactions. Every phone call, every email, every casual comment was a thread I could follow, a weakness I could later leverage. It wasn't malicious, it was necessary. The quiet power of understanding someone before they understand you became the foundation of my planning. Knowledge, I realized, was the only revenge worth pursuing. In parallel, I reflected on my own actions, my patience, my silence, my ability to endure uncertainty. These were not weaknesses, they were strengths cultivated over years of careful observation and calculated restraint. I realized that true power wasn't in confrontation or in loud declarations of hurt. It was in waiting, in preparing, in letting the betrayer act first while you quietly maintain control. And that insight gave me a strange comfort, a sense of quiet superiority that was both soothing and motivating. By the end of that week, I had made a decision. I would not confront her. I would not demand apologies, nor would I seek to humiliate her with public exposure. The only path forward, the only path that would truly satisfy me, was one of quiet, deliberate strategy. She believed she had cornered me, that her plan was airtight. And that belief, that misplaced confidence, would be the very thing that ensured my ultimate victory. Patience, observation, and subtle leverage, these would be my allies in a game she thought she was winning. I spent the next several weeks in quiet observation, letting the world move around me, while I meticulously gathered information. Every transaction she made, every casual boast, every slight overstep became a clue. I didn't need to confront her. I needed to understand the structure of her plan, the points of vulnerability she had unknowingly exposed. Patience had become a weapon, and silence was my shield. The more I watched, the more I realized just how fragile her confidence truly was. In the mornings, I went about my routine, as if nothing had happened. I smiled at colleagues, laughed at minor jokes, and appeared calm, even oblivious, in public. Behind closed doors, though, I mapped out possibilities, tested scenarios, and rehearsed outcomes in my mind. I considered every path she could take, every move she might make, and every potential slip that could give me leverage. It was a delicate game, like assembling a puzzle where every piece moved independently, yet all fit together if approached correctly. The leverage came unexpectedly, a minor detail she had never thought to secure, a financial oversight, buried deep in paperwork she assumed no one else would examine, emerged as a weak point. It wasn't dramatic, there were no glaring errors, no obvious mistakes, just a subtle vulnerability that, when combined with my preemptive trust measures, allowed me to regain control quietly and invisibly. The satisfaction wasn't in the exposure itself, but in knowing I had anticipated this long before she had conceived her plan. I began drafting a strategy, step by step, always measured, always deliberate. Each action had to appear natural, as if it were mere coincidence, never forced or retaliatory. My goal wasn't to humiliate her, nor to punish her with drama. It was to restore balance and assert control in a way that was both silent and undeniable. Every small decision, every subtle adjustment, was part of a larger tapestry that she had no idea I was weaving. There was a strange peace in the quietness of it all. Whereas she had relied on noise, on manipulation, on the expectation that my reaction would be emotional and immediate, I relied on patience, intellect, and observation. Her overconfidence became her weakness, and my restraint became my strength. Every move she made unknowingly led her closer to the very outcome I had quietly engineered. By the end of the month, I knew the moment of action was near. I didn't rush, and I didn't announce my intentions. I simply positioned myself in the perfect place to allow her own missteps to unravel her plan. The excitement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a quiet thrill in knowing that every step had been anticipated and every eventuality accounted for. The stage was set. Now, it was only a matter of time. The day it began to unravel, nothing looked unusual on the surface. She continued her routine, confident that her plan remained intact, smiling as if she were the one holding the reins. But behind the scenes, the subtle leverage I had identified started shifting everything. Emails went unanswered. Minor financial discrepancies she had overlooked began surfacing, and her carefully constructed narrative began showing cracks. She was still unaware that her victory was quietly collapsing, and that was the most satisfying part of all. I kept my demeanor unchanged. In meetings, at family gatherings, even in casual conversations, I maintained a calm, composed presence. I didn't gloat, I didn't hint, I didn't react. Every interaction was a study in restraint. She tried to provoke, to elicit a response, to make me appear vulnerable, but I remained impenetrable. Each failed attempt chipped away at her confidence, a quiet erosion she couldn't understand or explain, and with every moment her control slipped further from her grasp. The brilliance of it wasn't in confrontation, but in observation. I let her missteps accumulate, carefully noting each one. Financial statements weren't just numbers, they were a reflection of her carelessness, of the cracks in her preparation. Every boast she made to friends, every casual dismissal of my foresight, became a thread in the web that would eventually ensnare her. I never needed to speak. The evidence, the structure, and her own overconfidence were doing the work for me. There was an almost poetic rhythm to it. The more she pressed forward, believing herself untouchable, the more she stumbled. Small frustrations began appearing in her demeanor, tightened smiles, subtle hesitations, micro-expressions of doubt. To anyone else, it might have seemed like coincidence. To me, it was proof that patience and preparation were far more powerful than any emotional outburst. Her empire, carefully built on manipulation and misdirection, was quietly fracturing under its own weight. I started receiving subtle confirmations from allies she had never considered. Colleagues who had quietly respected my diligence began noticing anomalies, independently questioning inconsistencies. Every small acknowledgement, every hushed conversation, fed into the momentum I had created without lifting a finger. The system was self-correcting, exposing her errors while protecting my position. She had underestimated me completely, and that miscalculation was all I needed. By the end of that week, I could see it in her posture, in the way she avoided certain topics, in the cautious tone creeping into her communications. Her confidence was no longer a shield, it was a cage she had built around herself, and I, having done nothing overtly aggressive, was standing at the center, fully aware of the collapse taking shape. It was quiet, calculated, and utterly satisfying, a victory achieved without confrontation, through strategy, silence, and the slow, inevitable revelation of truth. The collapse was subtle at first, almost imperceptible to anyone watching from the outside. She still walked into rooms with a smile, still tried to command authority, but the foundation beneath her had shifted. Conversations that once flowed smoothly became stilted. Colleagues who had once deferred to her now hesitated, consulting quietly with me instead. I said nothing, allowed nothing to escape my control, and simply observed as the structure she had relied upon quietly disintegrated. I watched her make small errors, mistakes that would have been minor if they weren't multiplied by her own lack of foresight. Every misstep became evidence, a reflection of overconfidence and negligence. It was almost elegant, how her silence became frantic, how her carefully maintained appearances began to crumble under scrutiny. She could no longer control. I didn't need to point anything out. The universe was orchestrating her accountability, and I was merely its calm observer. There were moments I could have exposed her publicly, moments where I could have confronted her with words sharp enough to sting, but I refrained. Revenge, I realized, isn't in theatrics or loud declarations. True revenge is quiet, deliberate, and complete. It doesn't require applause. It doesn't need validation. The most potent victory is the one that unfolds without your betrayer ever realizing you engineered it, leaving them to stumble on their own miscalculations while you remain untouched. The satisfaction came in small, almost imperceptible ways. Colleagues began questioning her decisions, pointing out inconsistencies she could no longer defend. Legal and financial oversight she had believed hidden came to light in ways that were undeniable. She tried to regain control, tried to mask panic with politeness. But every attempt was clumsy, every gesture slightly off, and through it all, I remained composed, the eye in the center of a quietly brewing storm. By midweek, she had started retreating from decisions she had once dominated, asking for guidance, deferring approvals, subtly seeking support she had never needed before. Her aura of authority, once sharp and commanding, had dulled to uncertainty, and I, still silent, still patient, felt a rare sense of emotional justice settle over me. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about triumphing over someone with louder displays. It was about balance restored, about a betrayal met with intelligence rather than impulsiveness. When she finally realized on a quiet afternoon that she could no longer manipulate outcomes to her favor, her expression betrayed everything she had tried to hide. Not humiliation, not rage, but a quiet acknowledgement that the game she thought she controlled had been hers to lose all along. I offered no commentary, no indulgence in her defeat. I simply continued my work, steady, composed, and entirely untouchable. And in that silence, the quiet victory I had planned for so long felt complete. The weeks that followed were strangely quiet, almost surreal. She still existed in the same spaces, occupied the same roles, yet her presence no longer commanded the room. I moved through my life with a calm certainty, aware of the invisible boundaries I had restored, the respect silently reclaimed, no confrontation, no dramatic reveal, only a subtle shift in the energy that made it impossible for her to assert control. It was as if the air itself had changed around us. I felt an unfamiliar sense of freedom, a detachment from the tension that had shadowed me for months. The betrayal, once a heavy burden pressing against my chest, had transformed into a lesson in patience, in observation, in the quiet power of restraint. I had not only protected what was mine, but I had done so without stooping to theatrics. The satisfaction came in the knowledge that intelligence, strategy, and calm resolve were more formidable than any anger-fueled reaction. The emotional closure was subtle, but profound. I no longer felt the need to revisit every slight, every whispered attempt at manipulation. The past had its place, but it no longer held dominion over my present. I realized that true power isn't in defeating others loudly. It's in mastering yourself, in holding your ground without being provoked, and in allowing the natural consequences of betrayal to unfold quietly around you. In time, I noticed the shift in those around us. People who had once been caught between our conflicting loyalties now looked to me for guidance, for stability, for reason. It wasn't a victory born of intimidation, nor of fear. It was respect, earned through calm consistency. The betrayal had inadvertently highlighted my patience, my strategic foresight, and the quiet resilience that had always been my greatest strength. Every interaction with her became neutral territory, devoid of past tension. I could observe her missteps without engagement, appreciate the lessons learned, and move forward without resentment. The peace I felt was not passive, it was active, deliberate, and born from understanding that justice had already been delivered in the most intelligent way possible, through silence, timing, and careful orchestration. In those quiet moments, I understood the full scope of what had occurred. The betrayal was not the end, nor was it a permanent mark on my life. It was a challenge that tested my patience, my judgment, and my emotional resilience, and in overcoming it, I discovered a form of freedom that could never be taken, a clarity that could never be shaken, and a quiet triumph that felt more profound than any confrontation or revenge story ever could. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm I hadn't anticipated. The house, the finances, the trust, all of it was secure, quietly protected, and managed exactly as I had planned. Yet the emotional landscape was more complex. I discovered that silence and patience, while powerful, also demanded constant vigilance. I had won, yes, but the echoes of betrayal lingered in the corners of memory, reminding me of the fragility of trust and the subtle ways people can weaponize it. I began reflecting more deeply on the nature of family and loyalty. There were days when I felt a pang of sadness, not for myself, but for the sister I had known, for the version of her that had existed before ambition and greed reshaped her. It was a reminder that betrayal is never purely about power. It is about human flaws, choices, and the moments when people prioritize self-interest over connection. Understanding that didn't diminish my vigilance, but it softened the edges of anger that might have lingered otherwise. During this period, I cultivated new boundaries. I no longer assumed that closeness implied loyalty. I learned to measure it in actions rather than words. Trust became something earned daily, and my patience became a filter for determining who truly deserved a place in my life. There was a quiet pride in this self-discipline, a reassurance that my emotional intelligence could guide me through even the subtlest forms of manipulation without compromising my integrity. Interestingly, the sister herself seemed to recognize the shift, though she never acknowledged it. There was a subtle tension in our interactions, a quiet acknowledgement of the invisible lines I had drawn. She no longer pressed or maneuvered. Her smiles were polite, measured, cautious. The game she once controlled had been recalibrated entirely by my silent hand, and her awareness of that fact brought a restraint I had never explicitly demanded. It was justice delivered in the most elegant, unspoken way possible. I also began using this time to rebuild and fortify my own sense of purpose. Projects, investments, and relationships that had been sidelined during the period of betrayal became focal points. Each step forward was an act of reclaiming space, of demonstrating to myself that life's trajectory is not dictated by those who try to manipulate it, but by the deliberate choices we make when we maintain composure and strategic thinking. By the end of the year, I realized that my quiet victory had given me more than material security. It had given me mastery over my own emotional world. Betrayal had forced me to refine patience into a tangible skill, to recognize the power in observation over reaction, and to see that the most satisfying resolutions are often those that unfold without drama, without spectacle, and without giving the betrayer the satisfaction of awareness. By the following spring, the subtle consequences of her miscalculations began to surface more visibly. She remained polite, even cooperative, but there was a quiet hesitance in her movements, a carefulness that hadn't existed before. Opportunities she had once taken for granted now required scrutiny and deliberate thought. I didn't need to intervene. The structure I had created allowed her own mistakes to dictate outcomes. It was fascinating to watch someone who had thrived on overconfidence learn restraint without being told. I started noticing the way people around her responded differently as well. Colleagues who had once deferred to her unquestioningly began consulting with me first, seeking insight and clarity. Her authority was subtly undermined, not by confrontation, but by credibility built through consistency, patience, and foresight. The truth was not spoken aloud, but it resonated in every decision, every choice, every interaction. The universe, it seemed, had a quiet way of reinforcing fairness when the groundwork was carefully laid. I reflected often on the nature of justice and personal power. True authority, I realized, doesn't come from domination or aggression. It comes from mastery of self, from calm discernment, from the ability to let consequences unfold naturally, while maintaining unwavering composure. I had learned that anger is fleeting, confrontation is often self-defeating, and subtlety, the art of quiet strategy, can shape outcomes far more effectively than any dramatic showdown. There were days when I revisited old memories, recollecting the betrayal in sharp detail. Yet instead of resentment, I felt clarity and calm. Every misstep she had made, every subtle error, had been anticipated. Every move she thought was cunning had been accounted for in my planning. And in that realization, I discovered a profound satisfaction, one that did not require her acknowledgement or apology, but existed purely in the awareness of her quiet defeat and my unshaken control. With this new understanding, I began extending my focus beyond just family dynamics. Relationships, work, and investments became arenas for measured, deliberate action. I approached each with the same strategic patience, observing, listening, and calculating without rush or noise. Every success was a quiet confirmation that the lessons learned from betrayal were not merely defensive but transformative, providing a foundation for intelligent, self-respecting living. In those months, I realized something crucial. Victory is not about dominance or spectacle. It is about presence, control, and integrity. My life was no longer dictated by the actions of someone who sought to manipulate it. It was directed by my own choices, executed with precision, and protected by the calm strength that comes from knowing one has foreseen every possible angle. The betrayal had been a test, and I had emerged not just unbroken but elevated. As the months turned into a year, the subtle decline in her influence became undeniable. Decisions she had once taken for granted now required approval. Her suggestions questioned, her authority second-guessed by those who had silently observed the shifts in control. It was never allowed fall from grace. She retained her position, her face remained composed, but the power she had assumed as hers had quietly slipped through her fingers. I didn't need to intervene. The structure I had established ensured that she was undone by her own miscalculations. I, on the other hand, felt a freedom that I hadn't experienced before. Every day, I moved with clarity and purpose, unburdened by fear of betrayal or manipulation. I made decisions confidently, invested in projects I had once hesitated on, and deepened connections with people I could trust. The quiet control I wielded wasn't about domination over her. It was mastery over my own environment, an assurance that my life was guided by intelligence and foresight rather than impulse or reaction. Watching her carefully navigate the pitfalls she had created for herself was almost meditative. Each small hesitation, each cautious tone, each recalculated decision became a silent affirmation of my strategy. There was no satisfaction in humiliation, no joy in overt victory, only a calm recognition that patience, intelligence, and deliberate planning had shifted the balance without a single harsh word. The elegance of it was almost poetic, justice delivered quietly, decisively, without spectacle. I began to notice a broader change in my own perspective. Betrayal, once a source of shock and pain, had become a teacher. I had learned that strength is often invisible, that quiet observation can accomplish what confrontation cannot, and that the most profound victories come when one maintains dignity, calm, and foresight. Life had become a field for strategic, mindful action, where every choice carried weight, every decision was deliberate, and every outcome reflected patience over impulse. Even interactions with her became exercises in calm dominance. She approached conversations cautiously, aware on some level that her previous tactics no longer held sway. I listened, responded with measured neutrality, and allowed her to navigate the conversation on my terms. The power dynamic was clear, though unspoken. I had regained control, not through confrontation but through intelligence, timing, and the quiet orchestration of outcomes she could no longer influence. By the end of this period, I realized that what I had gained was more than security or authority. It was peace, clarity, and an unwavering sense of self. The betrayal that had once threatened to destabilize me had instead strengthened me, refining patience into a tool, strategy into a shield, and observation into a form of quiet, enduring power. I had moved from reactive to proactive, from vulnerable to unshakable, and from hurt to fully in control. By now, the patterns of her decline were fully visible, though still quiet and unobtrusive to anyone outside our circle. Her once confident gestures now carried hesitation. Her decisions were slower, layered with self-doubt she could never quite hide. Every opportunity she had taken for granted now required careful calculation, and even then the outcomes rarely aligned with her expectations. It was a slow, inevitable unraveling, orchestrated not by my hands but by her own missteps, magnified by the foresight and restraint I had cultivated long before the betrayal began. I, in contrast, moved through life with a sense of unshakable stability. Every choice I made was deliberate, every action measured, and every outcome guided by the quiet mastery of my own judgment. I no longer feared manipulation, nor did I worry about hidden agendas. I had learned to read people with precision and to anticipate potential pitfalls before they could materialize. This wasn't merely revenge, it was personal empowerment, a reclaiming of space and peace that had once been threatened. Interestingly, her behavior began to reflect not just insecurity, but a subtle acknowledgement of my position. She deferred to me more frequently, tempered her tone, and approached decisions with an almost unconscious caution. I never confronted her, never highlighted my awareness. Yet the shift in her demeanor made it clear that she understood deep down that she was no longer in control. That quiet recognition, unspoken yet undeniable, became a profound form of justice, one that required no public spectacle to achieve its full effect. I began to notice that this dynamic extended beyond her too. Others who had witnessed her overconfidence now respected my calm authority, trusting my judgment and seeking guidance without hesitation. My reputation, built on quiet competence and strategic patience, now overshadowed her previous influence, and I realized that true power doesn't require assertion. It is earned through consistency, foresight, and the ability to navigate betrayal without losing composure. In these moments, I also reflected on the lessons of patience and observation I had learned. Every betrayal, every subtle manipulation, had forced me to refine my instincts, to develop emotional intelligence, and to harness quiet strategy as a tool for both protection and advancement. It became clear that the greatest victories are never those announced loudly. They are those lived quietly, measured in the consistency of one's actions and the clarity of one's decisions. By the end of this chapter, I had reached a place of almost complete peace. The sister who had once sought to undermine me now existed as a shadow of her former self, constrained not by my interference, but by her own mistakes and the careful, deliberate planning I had put into motion. I had regained what was mine, safeguarded my legacy, and cultivated a sense of mastery that extended far beyond material security. The betrayal had been transformed into wisdom, and the quiet victory had become an enduring testament to patience, strategy, and self-respect. Time, as it often does, continued its quiet progression, and with it came an unexpected serenity. The tension that had once pervaded my life, the shadow of betrayal, gradually receded into memory. I could walk into rooms without calculating every word or anticipating every motive, a freedom I had never known. The past no longer dictated my present, the lessons remained, but they had transformed into a sense of calm authority, a knowledge that I could navigate any storm without being undone. I found myself reflecting on the subtle artistry of human behavior, on how betrayal can serve as both a test and a teacher. It had forced me to sharpen my senses, refine my patience, and embrace a type of power that is invisible yet absolute. Watching her falter was not about delight in her failure, but a quiet acknowledgement that intelligence and restraint could outmatch manipulation and hubris. In every subtle hesitation she displayed, I saw the proof of foresight and strategy's enduring strength. Gradually, I began investing more deeply in myself, personal projects, long-delayed ambitions, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than convenience. I no longer carried the weight of others' agendas. I was guided solely by foresight, judgment, and the knowledge that control comes not from force, but from preparation, calm, and clarity. Every step I took was deliberate, every choice anchored in the hard-earned wisdom that betrayal had imparted. Even in encounters with her, the dynamic had shifted entirely. Our interactions were neutral, almost professional, devoid of tension or animosity. She no longer attempted to manipulate, no longer sought advantage, no longer assumed control, and yet she remained a quiet reminder of what had been overcome, a living testament to the power of patience and silent strategy. I did not need to assert dominance. The balance of power had shifted without a single word, without a single spectacle. I began noticing how much lighter life felt when one is no longer driven by fear of betrayal. Decisions flowed naturally, relationships thrived under genuine respect, and every achievement carried a sense of quiet triumph rather than superficial victory. The peace I had cultivated was rooted in control, not control over others, but control over myself and my environment, ensuring that nothing and no one could destabilize the life I had carefully reclaimed. By the end of this period, I could finally articulate what had been accomplished without pride or arrogance. I had turned betrayal into wisdom, manipulation into clarity, and a threatened future into one of deliberate freedom. The quiet victory was complete, not because she had failed publicly, but because I had mastered the art of responding with intelligence, patience, and calm strength. I had reclaimed my life, fully, decisively, and with a sense of peace that could never be taken away. Years later, I still reflect on that period as one of the most transformative in my life. The betrayal, once a source of raw shock, now feels like a carefully placed lesson in patience, observation, and emotional intelligence. I realize that life rarely tests us with outright confrontations. It's the subtle, quiet manipulations that demand true strength. I had been forced to sharpen my awareness, to cultivate restraint, and to trust in the power of strategy over emotion. The sister who had once sought to control my future had faded into a careful, cautious presence, competent enough to maintain appearances, but stripped of the arrogance that had defined her earlier actions. I never gloated, never made her stumble publicly. My victory was measured not in spectacle, but in the quiet assurance that she could never manipulate outcomes at my expense again. Each interaction became a calm affirmation that control had returned to me, and that my patience and foresight had achieved what anger never could. I also noticed how the experience reshaped my relationships beyond family. Friends, colleagues, and partners began to recognize the value of reliability, observation, and thoughtful decision-making. Trust became a currency I understood intimately, one I offered carefully, knowing that the strength of a bond is proven not in words, but in consistency and foresight. The lessons learned from betrayal now guided every choice I made, every project I undertook, and every relationship I nurtured. There were moments, quiet ones, when I revisited the details of her missteps. Each small hesitation, each subtle miscalculation, reminded me of the elegance of restraint and the power of planning. I had orchestrated no dramatic confrontation. I had simply ensured that her own errors aligned perfectly with the structure I had silently prepared. It was a masterclass in patience and intelligence, and it left me feeling not only vindicated, but profoundly self-reliant. Through it all, I came to understand that freedom is the greatest reward. Not the freedom of vengeance, nor the fleeting satisfaction of humiliation, but the deeper liberation of knowing one has mastered oneself and one's circumstances. I moved through life unshaken by fear, unclouded by resentment, and guided solely by reason, foresight, and the quiet strength that comes from enduring and overcoming betrayal. By the time I reached full adulthood in my career and personal life, I had internalized a truth that reshaped my approach to challenges forever, that silence, patience, and strategic observation can yield results far more satisfying than confrontation ever could. The quiet victory was not a fleeting moment. It was a permanent shift in my life, one that allowed me to move forward with clarity, confidence, and a sense of peace that could never be disrupted by manipulation again. By now, life had returned to a rhythm that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. The sister who had once threatened to destabilize my world existed as a quiet presence, no longer capable of controlling or undermining me. I moved through my days with a sense of freedom that I had never known before, unburdened by fear, unshaken by doubt, and fully aware of the quiet power I had cultivated. Every decision, every step was guided by experience, foresight, and the unshakable confidence that comes from mastering one's own life. I often reflected on the journey, realizing that the greatest lessons came not from victory itself, but from the patience and restraint required to achieve it. Anger and confrontation had never been tools I wished to wield. They are fleeting, combustible, and rarely transformative. True power, I had learned, comes from observation, planning, and the subtle orchestration of outcomes. By letting the consequences of betrayal unfold naturally, I had reclaimed not just my material security, but my emotional sovereignty. The peace I felt was profound. I no longer carried resentment or the temptation for retaliation. The quiet victory had already delivered justice without spectacle. I had taken control in ways she could neither perceive nor counteract. And in that silence, I found liberation. Each day became a reaffirmation of self-mastery, a reminder that life's challenges could be met with intelligence, calm, and strategy rather than anger or drama. I also discovered a deeper sense of empathy. Oddly enough, through the ordeal, betrayal is a window into human weakness, ambition, and fear. Understanding this allowed me to forgive without condoning, to move forward without bitterness, and to nurture relationships built on genuine respect rather than fear or obligation. My triumph was not merely practical, it was moral, emotional, and spiritual, shaping the way I navigated every interaction thereafter. Looking back, I realized that the sister's betrayal had been the catalyst I needed to discover my true resilience. It forced me to sharpen my judgment, embrace patience, and cultivate a sense of inner authority that no one could ever compromise. I had turned what could have been a moment of devastation into a lifetime of clarity, strength, and freedom. The quiet victory was no longer a strategy. It had become a permanent part of who I was. Now, as I reflect on everything, I can say with certainty that peace and control are the ultimate rewards. The betrayal that once threatened my world became the very vehicle for my growth. I had navigated the storm without losing myself, reclaimed what was mine without aggression, and discovered a power that no one could ever take from me. Life, I realized, is not about responding loudly to wrongs, but about mastering oneself quietly and moving forward with dignity. And so, I stand fully unburdened, fully sovereign, and fully free. The past is a teacher, the betrayal a lesson, and the victory an enduring testament to patience, strategy, and emotional mastery. I am no longer defined by what others have done to me, but by the calm intelligence, restraint, and foresight with which I have navigated the world. In that, I have found ultimate closure, a quiet, complete, and lasting peace.